Hi, we return to Genesis 24 today as Laban appears on the scene for the first time. And literally for the first time, as we'll see, because when the lineage of Rebekah was given back in chapter 11 from the children of Milcah, Laban wasn't listed. So this is the first time we're hearing about him. Before we jump into that verse, I'd like to just take a moment to go back over the last verse, the transition we saw from last time. I kind of ran over it, and that's pun intended, given that Rebekah runs and now Laban's running all over the place. And so I skipped the part about her running, which highlights, again, as we've seen, the urgency as well as her diligence. But another thing I wanted to focus on is that the servant had asked if there was room in the father's house, and now the narrator tells us that she ran and told her mother's household. So I want to pause and consider that for just a moment. Sarna notes, in this society, a girl would ordinarily refer to her home as her mother's house. But Menachem Perry offers something richer than that, and of course it's partly speculation, but it will help us get through the story here. He notes that the contrast between the father's house in verse 23, as I just noted, and mother's house here, is to explain the presence of Bethuel in 24:50. And he says, Bethuel is staying at the father's house, while Rebekah and her mother are staying at the mother's house. Only Laban, who meddles in everything, runs about to and fro. And from the medieval Midrash, Rashi notes that the women had separate houses, and, quote, a daughter, of course, confides only in her mother. And this reading is over against those who see the inclusion of Bethuel at 24:50 as a redactional little clip in there, that Bethuel is not really part of the story and is just inserted in there for some clumsy redactional thing. But as I've been saying throughout this and all the other series, when there's a question between attributing it to sources and trying to read it as written, I'm always going to lean toward trying to read it as written, and that's what Menachem Perry helps us with in this particular instance. So we note there's a tension here between the mother's house and the father's house, and we'd already known that she named herself, as we saw, in terms of her grandmother here. And while I have the lineage up, it's worth noting, because now as we start our passage for today, Rebekah had a brother whose name is Laban. We did not hear about him back here. These 8, Milcah bore to Nahor, Abraham's brother, back here, and although some of these are just names that we don't know another thing about, they're just mentioned there and there's no one else like them, it's interesting, isn't it, that Laban isn't mentioned. So now he is. The narrator intervenes here with a little help for us as readers. Rebekah had a brother whose name was Laban. And the name Laban means white. In feminine form, Levanah, and as Sarna notes, as many others have said, an epithet of the moon god, the chief deity of Haran, which you can see here in one of its forms, also known as Nana, here with the beard and such, and here's the insignia of the moon god. So here we are in Haran, where Laban has the name that's a symbol of that. It would be not that different, perhaps, than being in a Latin-X country and knowing someone named Jesus. And so here we have Laban. And Laban ran out to the man, to the spring. Notice that out of all the things that we're going to see in this chapter of the repetitions, and we'll look at today when we get to verse 37 of the servant's repetition of his original encounter with Abraham, here we just have the narrator's brief summary. The girl ran and told her mother's household about these things. So we don't get to hear her version of it. We're going to get to hear the servant's version of it, who's referred to throughout this story as simply the man, as we've been seeing here. And so here's the key words section we're on here, and we can see the man throughout this. He's not named. The fact that the Midrash and so many commentators assume it's Sir Abraham's servant Eleazar, who we at least heard about in chapter 15, is belied by the fact that the text simply refuses to call him that and simply refers to him as the man. And one thing I've been trying to do is, although the text has been showing this here from Abraham's and then by agency through the servant's perspective, is to also turn it around and see what this looks like from Rebekah and Laban's perspective. And the narrator helps us with this. In verse 30, we certainly see Laban's perspective from the narrator telling us, as soon as he had seen the nose ring and the bracelets on his sister's arms, and when he heard the words. So we're going to hear Laban's perspective. But I'd like to suggest, before we hear that, based on what we have to assume Rebekah told Laban, is that there's a suitor out there at the well, and presumably that was a suitor for her. We don't know at this point whether she has siblings, or whether she, like Rachel in the next generation, has a sister, elder sister named Leah, as Rachel does, and so we don't know if there's any competition or not here. We know nothing about the children of this generation. So there's an interesting piece of suspense there, but in the end there will be no other sisters that are noted. So Laban ran out to the man, presuming that there's a suitor there with 10 camels. He must have told him about the 10 camels that she's watered all the way till they were done drinking. And he's thinking, a rich suitor. And notice, emphasizing the spring here, not the well. And as my note below has from the Midrash, since the word for spring in Hebrew is ayin, literally meaning eye, it's suggesting a play out of here that Laban eyed the servant. And that's certainly the case, as we see, because he saw him here. Now my note below has the ulterior motive that causes the running, fitting the Laban we will learn from about later regarding Jacob. Only here do we know that the servant actually gave them to her, as we see. The nose ring and the bracelets on his sister's arms. And when he heard the words of his sister Rebekah, and this is the only piece of it that we hear reported in direct speech via the narrator here, thus the man spoke to me, although we don't know what that was. That will echo into the type scene we see in the New Testament when Jesus meets the Samaritan woman at the well, and she goes back to her people in a parallel to this story here. But in that story, it's not exactly a wedding that follows, or is it? But that's for another series. So thus the man spoke to me without knowing what it was he said. He went to the man, and behold, there he was, as almost always in ORSV leaves out the Hannah, behold, standing by the camels at the spring. And one of the things that we're seeing here, or not seeing as the case may be, is this is taking place in the city, a city named Haran. You can see it here on the map as I showed it earlier. But there's almost no sense here of entering into the city, of coming from the outside by the well or the spring, and then passing through city gates and what the city people think. Although we know the city is named Haran, it hasn't been in this passage. It will be later as the city of Laban as Haran, but we've simply known it as the place of Abraham's having been in the past. And so, interestingly, it says the original command was the place of my birth, but that would have been Ur, and he's certainly not going all the way back to Ur. So that's another element we haven't considered yet. But he beholds the man standing at the spring, and then we hear his response, "Come in, O blessed of Yahweh." And as my note below has, the Midrash suggests that Laban's generosity is based on his assumption that if Rebekah got such good gifts, he would get better ones. Notice the sexism of that. He's not the father, they're brother and sister. So the only reason he would have to assume he's getting better ones is the men get better gifts than the women. And that's certainly part of the Mesopotamian worldview here that is implicitly being challenged. And I want to note while I'm on that point that for the exilic or post-exilic audience here, Laban certainly represents where they've been or where they still are, depending upon when we think this was written, in the country of Babylon. So his viewpoint and how sticky it's going to be to get out of here, and how much stickier the next generation it's going to be for Jacob to get out of there, is certainly expressing something about the question of leaving Babylon during exile. And if you were in exile and you didn't know the Persians were going to come and release you, that might be the real question. Can you escape from it somehow, or do you have to wait for some superior force to defeat it, and then you're, of course, beholden to that superior force, as the Ezra and Nehemiah folks try to make all the folks in the province of YHWH do by equating the law of the Persian king and the law of their God. So all that's in the background here as we encounter Laban. So he interprets blessing as material wealth. And certainly many people have to this day, although, as I've been trying to point out, Genesis does not. Genesis sees blessing as fertility, as the fertility of the earth, which was thwarted by the violation in the garden, and thus having to fight with the earth for food rather than just to receive it as gift, and the fertility of bodies, which again was thwarted not because the woman would not have babies, but because the conditions of agriculture would require more babies and make pregnancy and childbirth a major risk of death for women. And so that's the kind of blessing that Genesis is presenting over against the kind of material blessing of empire that we see in the Babylonians here, embodied in Laban, and throughout empires throughout the ages of almost whatever cultural context. So here he is, blessed, as Sternberg notes, ignorant of antecedents and identities, as we saw back in 22:17 and 24:1. Laban twists this charged phrase into homage to material blessing. And another question I ask down below is, how does Laban know the name Yahweh? He does not know where these people are from. No matter what Rebekah told him, the servant has not yet said where he's from. We're only going to hear this here. And so Laban does not know that they would worship Yahweh. And so he pulls that out of his own head somehow. and then continues, "Why do you stand outside when I prepared the house and a place for the camels?" And my note below has still as if it's only the man and not a whole entourage, as we'll hear, singular here. Stand outside. And notice he went to meet him by the spring, so they've obviously left the city gate and gone out. We don't know exactly how far it is because we have no sense of where the house is in relation to the gate. But it's got to be some distance here to out where the young women, or whatever age women, would be out there getting their water and watering camels and whatever other animals are out there. So why do you stand outside? And notice the link here with the inside-outside stuff in the Sodom and Gomorrah story that we saw earlier. When I have prepared, using the first person singular, or first person formal here, Anoki, and the Midrash suggests, the emphasis suggests Laban did it personally, that he has personally prepared the house, highlighting that he is there as a servant for the servant, although he doesn't yet know this person is a servant. The word for I have prepared here, with the root PNH there, as you can see, literally meaning turned, only in 1822 in Genesis, outside this chapter where Yahweh and Abraham have been discussing the question of the fate of Sodom. And then we'll see it later in this chapter. It's implying, without stating, that Laban has joined the rushing around. The Midrash suggests that he'd cleaned the house of the defilement of idols. But at the same time, other Midrash accuses Laban of being idolatrous. And throughout the ages of Midrash, scholars argue about whether Laban is an evil villain or whether he's simply a foreigner who should be treated with respect. But we'll see more of that in this story and in the story in chapter 29 later. So I prepared the house and a place for the camels. So plainly, Rebekah has told him about the camels. And where would you put the camels? It's interesting to wonder, do you have to leave the camels outside the city, or would you bring the camels into the city? Would they have some kind of a barn or some kind of shelter for the camels in the city? I was not able to find out anything about that. So having Laban expressed his view, now we see the response, and wordlessly, the man, as we see here, came into the house. And Laban unloaded the camels. So now the answer to my question there is that the camels seem to have come, if not into the house, at least near the house. And Laban unloading the camels, or literally opening them, as later we'll hear that God opens wounds, and gave him the very straw and fodder that Rebekah had told the servant they had. And now adds to that, and water to wash his feet and the feet of the men who were with him. And that's the first time we're hearing this. And notice the male-female aspect of water. So we saw Rebekah at the well trying to get water, and the narrator told us that women go down to get water. And now it's Laban, the man, providing the water to wash his feet, as Abraham provided the water for the visitors to wash the feet back in 18:4, and as Lot offered for those same visitors in 19:2. So far, Laban's looking like a pretty good host, isn't he? And now we hear again about these men with him. We don't know how many there are, but there must be several to take care of the camels and to cover this 900-kilometer journey, which the Midrash says that he took in just a miraculous 3 hours. So here, looking at the verse first, then we'll look at the note. Then food was set before him to eat, but he said, I will not eat until I have told my errand. Which is at one level rude to hospitality, but also expressing the urgency of it. My note below notes that the Hebrew word sequence doubles key words here. The word for put, shem here, and the word for eat, and the word for speak 3 times in this scene here. So highlighting the change in momentum from the family's act of putting food on the table, the neutralizing of the expected act of eating, and the shift of the servant's mission of speaking. And as by further note from Perry has below, there could be no doubt that right up to the moment the servant opens his mouth, neither Rebekah nor any other member of her family could possibly know that he is not the actual suitor. And that certainly makes sense out of the scene here. There's no reason to think otherwise. Food was set here. It's only here in the Hebrew scripture, although as noted, it's doubled there. And then I've told my errand is literally, unless I've spoken my speech. And presumably the he is Laban here, says speak on, and so we begin to get the speech. And to hear that, I want to focus on this scene here, even though it doesn't start until verse 37, where we're going to walk through the contrasts as modern scholars have done, as medieval scholars have done, and as the ancient Midrash did, every close reader noting that the retelling is rhetorically changing this to make the whole situation impossible for Laban and the household to refuse. So let's get some of this speech on, and we'll go through verse 41 today. So he said, I am Abraham's servant. So bringing that out there, using ego eimi and the Septuagint, which is the strong sense of I am here. It was used in Genesis 17:1 for Yahweh there. And so we have that introduction. And note the accuracy of the servant's report of both events, and yet the changes we'll see as well. So here, the Yahweh has greatly blessed my master, echoing what we saw in 13:2. We can see that there. Now, Abram was very rich in livestock and silver and gold, at least from the perspective that the servant is playing into Laban's view of what blessing is. Notice that it wasn't called blessing there. And he has become wealthy, although the word for wealthy is the phrase here, meod via gadal, here, meaning become powerfully great, which doesn't imply wealth as such. It's not a money term, but it's certainly to become powerfully great suggests wealth and power. And it's described here in material terms. He's given him flocks and herds, silver and gold, male and female slaves, camels and donkeys. And notice what's going on there. This is attributing to Yahweh what was provided by Pharaoh or by Abimelech in the two wife-sister stories. And so that's an interesting theological perspective, although we don't know that the servant's been around all that time, although he was described as the senior servant. So it certainly suggests he's seen all that here, and these things that we've seen. So he provides all that, first of all saying, I'm working for a wealthy master. And at this point you might assume that the master is perhaps the suitor, but we're going to go on and hear verse 36 to here. And as Sternberg notes, the son is sandwiched between two otherwise over-specific references to his parents, calculated to recommend the son. So let's hear what we hear about the mother. And Sarah, my master's wife, bore a son to my master when she was old, and he has given him all that he has. Why would it be rhetorically helpful to say that she bore a son when he was old? Well, as Sternberg notes, then he is still young now, and if she bore him by a miracle, then he must be blessed and is certainly the only heir. As Perry adds, and since he intends to match Abraham's son with the granddaughter of his brother, he wishes to set his addressees at ease with regard to the bridegroom's age by indicating that he was born in his mother's advanced old age, which, although Sternberg and Perry are making those comments over the last few decades, centuries ago the Midrash had, how can you expect to pair a son of Abraham with the granddaughter of Abraham's brother Nahor? And so all readings understanding that this point here is to highlight that I'm trying to connect you with my master's son, but he's not as old as you might think he is. Since they would certainly know that Abraham is Rebekah and Laban's great uncle. And he has given him all that he has, which has not been made true yet. We will see it's made true, the narrator tells us at 25:5, but it doesn't happen until then. And interestingly, after Abraham has a whole other family and 7 more kids, but he gives it all to Isaac, highlighting, as we'll see then, that it was just something for his old age, but not a love and depth relationship as he had with Sarah and Isaac, even with his brief relationship with the son Isaac. So here it's simply a rhetorical comment to highlight that all that my master had with the silver and gold and the flocks and slaves will belong to the woman I take with me. And then he continues here, and now we get into the parallels. So we heard in verse 4, the Canaanites among whom I live, and here it's changed to the Canaanites in whose land I live. My master made me swear, saying, you shall not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites in whose land I live, making him sound like a resident alien in Canaan, whose real home is here in the old country with Laban. And notice that difference. Rather than it being that he's actually moved to another place, it's like a Cuban in Florida who's gone back to Cuba to find a spouse and recognizing that Cuba is still home no matter how long they've lived in Florida. So he continues here in verse 38. We had, in the original, will go to my country, but here we have, you shall go to my father's house, to my kindred here, or literally mishpaha, the clans. Let's look at some details here. As Sternberg notes, with the result of the ethno-geographic opposition between Canaanite and non-Canaanite transforms into the sentimental opposition between non-family and family. The misquoter personalizes each of Abraham's spatial references to there into my kindred, so as to substitute tie of blood for a sense of distance. So we can go back and look at that here. We saw up here at the beginning of chapter 4 all the references to there, and now when we're in our current scene, we have the references to kindred. So a nice way, I think, that looking at the key words highlights what we're seeing here, that he's changing that. And notice what that's saying to Laban. Rather than having a sense that I've been living in a foreign place and And I've been told not to go back to another foreign place. Rather, I'm told to go to family and get a wife from family here. And mishpacha is often translated as family, but it's properly clan. So kindred is really not the right word here. The Norris V translates a couple of different words as kindred. Clan would be a good one here to pick someone from not the Beit Ab, the immediate father's house, but the next level, and what will become Israelite organization beyond that to the tribe and to the nation. So he continues here. I said to my master, perhaps the women will not follow me. And notice the difference again, leaving out land. And notice in all these, the sublimation of land for family here. So go to my country is substituted for you go to my father's house. Perhaps a woman may not be willing to follow me to this land is replaced just not follow me, period. As Sternberg notes below, in retelling, it not only fails to glance at any reluctance on the girl's part, but throws the responsibility square on her guardians. And the Midrash accord. He therefore makes it clear to them that even if the woman will in fact not follow me through no ill will of her own, but because of family hindrance, Abraham's oath will be nullified. So in other words, not putting it on that the woman will not follow, but that people in her family will not allow her to follow, but not saying it quite like that. And then completely omitted is the question of what if not. And obviously what Abraham was expressing is an abhorrence of the old country, even though he's sending the servant back to get a family member, a wife from there. But obviously he's not going to tell them that the old country was seemed abhorrent to his master. So that's left out altogether here as we move into verse 40. So, and omitting the God of heaven who took me from my father's house and the promise of land as well here. Notice the difference here. But he said to me, Yahweh, before whom I walk. And notice how small that's making it. Rather than the God of heaven and earth, it's making it simply a family God, which would make sense to a Laban, even though his name connects to a national god, the moon god Sin, and the moon being one of the central deities in the Babylonian pantheon. Still, this is making it like a family god, just like a local god, rather than a competition with Marduk and the larger national gods. So he's not setting up here my gods versus your gods, but our little local gods that we worship, and you can have your local gods as well. And notice the shift here. Yahweh before me will send his angel with you and make your way successful, in contrast to before you, as we saw there. So that evoked the Exodus for readers here. But with you is suggesting right with you. So if Yahweh's angel is with you, how can you possibly go wrong? You shall get a wife for my son from my kindred and from my father's house. Then you will be free from my oath. And notice a little ABA chiasm in verse 41, free from my oath twice here. And as Perry notes, by increasing Abraham's part, the servant belittles that of God. My oath here, Abraham's oath, as opposed to God's oath. And the word for this word for oath, Allah, is only here in Genesis. Different word for oath we see other places. So when you come to my kindred, even if they will not give her to you, making that point that even if they are the barriers, as Wenham notes below, he omits only, you must not take my son back there, just to mention it might put ideas into her family's head. Then you'll be free from my oath. So then he begins to talk about the situation of what happened here, and that's where we'll pick up next time, wondering how Laban and Rebekah and anybody else who's there are receiving this version of the story so far. But we're not going to hear yet because the servant is going to keep talking, and we'll hear him continue next time. See you then for that. Bye.